Welcome to From the Spectrum podcast. This is a podcast about autism. It is my goal to explain what is autism. I plan to use a mixture of scientific literature, personal experience, and opinion. With opinion, I will explain why I feel the way I do and give examples. I will provide links to various references for each episode. For each episode, we will discuss various aspects of autism. For today's episode, it is my pleasure, with overwhelming excitement, to announce the first guest of the podcast. From UCLA, George Tarjan Distinguished Professor of Psychiatry and Education, Dr. Catherine Lord. Dr. Lord is not just any guest. When I and most others think about autism research, knowledge, and education, there's a short list at the top. The top of the top tier. With numerous contributions, such as the Autism Diagnostic Interview, or the ADI, the Social Communication Questionnaire, and the Autism Diagnostic Observation Schedule, or ADOS. Two are considered the gold standards in autism assessment. In addition, to back my thoughts about Dr. Lord's contributions to autism, a paper released in 2023 in Frontiers in Psychiatry shows she has the most impact and productivity in autism from the years 2011 to 2022. As you listen, please consider some potential highlights of our conversation. Dr. Lord's journey into autism, and notice despite the highest impact score in autism research, she still takes referrals and sits in on IEP meetings. The evolution of the autism assessment process, and the evolution of the ADOS, from her basement and being overran by demand to the gold standard in autism assessment. How centralized money, medicine, and education interacts with autism, and the language used in policy and politics, and in the DSM. Remember my previous comments about the DSM. Don't get hitched on this book. And finally, how the word spectrum is interpreted in professional and in the public. An update on profound autism and the future of autism. And now, my discussion with Dr. Catherine Lord. Dr. Lord, why don't you begin with just telling us, when did you know autism was going to be your focus?
I think as an undergraduate, I worked for Lovas doing very traditional behavioral things. And I worked with two kids who I just loved. And by the end of working with him for a couple years, I was pretty negative about simple behavioral approaches. I felt like, boy, this is not the answer. But I loved the kids. And then I went to graduate school and deliberately went away from behaviorism. But in my last year of graduate school, I ended up just by accident teaching a class of kids. It was just after IDEA. So when special ed schools were required to let kids into school, kids with disabilities. And I taught a class of kids coming to school for the first time who were between 3 and 8 years of age. This was in rural Vermont. And in fact, about half the kids had autism.
Oh, wow.
All kinds of things. I mean, they ranged from, a really smart little girl who was blind, who also had autism, who could play the piano like you never heard it, and who used to shout at herself, "Tammy, stop playing that goddamn piano," which was very embarrassing, but who, to a child who couldn't talk, and everything in between. And I think then I just was like, oh my gosh, I really like these kids. I don't know why. um, and so then I went to, when I had to do an internship, I also was trying to find a position where there were people very committed to clinical work, but who also did research. And it was really hard because I found great researchers who didn't care at all about clinical work. And then I also found really good clinicians, but who were not reading or doing any research. And then I got the position in North Carolina at Teach, which at the time was, I mean, it wasn't brand new, but it was just folding out. And that was an amazing experience. So that just did it for me.
Oh,
um,
wow.
yeah.
So, as you described those children long ago, it seems like, correct me if I'm wrong, the profession and society didn't really recognize it yet as this big continuum or spectrum like you described it. Is that correct?
That is absolutely true. I mean, I think Lovas took on autism because he was very interested in behaviorism. And he thought that with these techniques, we can teach anybody anything.
Hmm.
And then he'd heard of these kids who weren't communicating in an ordinary fashion. So he literally, I mean, what was amazing was he brought kids out of a state hospital and they lived here on campus. And the idea was we were going to cure these kids, which is ridiculous. And then I worked with two kids, and one little guy never did what I was trying to get him to talk. He never talked. We
Mhm.
were both dying of boredom. So we spent a lot of time in the bathroom. I got him to, wash his hands, and we learned how to get paper towels. And we were really, I mean, about ready to throw spitballs, I think. And then the other guy was a kid who I think had stopped talking when he was sent to the institution. Once he came here and he had this army of predominantly young women working with him, he started talking, and he was ahead of me every step of the way. I would be like, all right, we're going to work on pronouns. And he would be saying, he would be using pronouns. So that was very interesting too. So I just felt like there's so much we don't understand here that, and I'm not completely negative about all behavioral techniques, but I think, it it was so oversimplified that what we were going to do, and what were we trying to accomplish. Um,
Yeah, uh, that's a great mindset. The idea of like the ABA or this behaviorism is interesting to me, whereas it's another human being instructing another human being on what they should be doing or ought to be doing. But who's to say that the instructing human being, it knows what's best for that, in this case, a child.
yeah. Yeah,
So,
I mean, that's the hard part, and I think with these two kids, we were way off with
mhm.
both of them, because one of them, he couldn't imitate sounds. So for us to spend 40 hours a week trying to get him to say "ba," and the idea that he was going to say "ba" in order to get a Frito, the poor kid couldn't do it, but he could do other things. And then the other kid was ahead of me. I mean, he was like, he could have taught me. The sad thing is he went back to the institution and stopped talking again. And so we were just we were doing something right, which was giving him all this positive attention. But the actual teaching of language was neither here nor there. And I do have very mixed feelings. I mean, I think hopefully I can say this well, because I do think sometimes we have to say, like, sometimes I have to say, look, as an adult, I do know more than you as a 3-year-old about what life is like and what you're going to need to learn. But also, I want to respect what you are good at and what you're interested in. And the more I can do that, the more we're going to learn together.
Absolutely. That's
And that's the trade-off. And I think we've had, real pushback from the autistic community. Like, let's not, I shouldn't be making any decisions. But sometimes I feel like, we have some patients who are periodically physically aggressive,
mhm.
and this is not good. It just harms them, and it's such a shame, because it restricts what they can do. And so I do think somebody then has to jump in and say, all right, how do we help them do other things? And so you do need somebody jumping in. On the other hand, I'm not trying to say, like, don't look at lines. If you like lines, you can look at lines all you want. And if you can draw by, that is wonderful. So let's build on your strength. But I am going to try to keep you, or from pulling your mother's hair or whatever.
Yes, just giving a little bit of different perspectives can go
Yeah,
a long way.
yeah.
So before the creation of the ADI and social communication questionnaire and the ADOS, what was the condition of the autism assessment like?
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that Teach did in North Carolina was they were one of the first groups to have like a standard assessment. So they had something called the PEP, the psychoeducational profile. And so the there was a standard assessment, but it didn't meet like the standards for testing that, some of the famous tests like the SAT or the WISC or it didn't meet those standards. But they were a group that really tried to help figure out, what do you do when you're face to face with a kid you've never met before, and how do you figure out what they can do. And one of the concepts they had, which we really used especially in the ADOS, is this idea of, if you present a task to a kid and they don't seem to be able to do it as you think they should, what do you do next? Like, how do you see if they can do it if you change something? If instead of putting out 20 blocks at once, you hand them one at a time. Is it just that there's too much stuff?
Mm,
Or is it that the blocks are wooden and they don't like wood?
yeah.
Or, those kinds of things. And so this idea of like a merging skill and being able to say, all right, this is how I needed to change in order to help the child that I'm working with be able to accomplish the task. And then how can I use that information in planning what we're going to do next?
Okay. Yeah. So as you describe such details about the instruments, from a creator, now we all know that these instruments get revised and modified throughout. Um, but how do you know when they need revised or modifications?
Oh goodness, they always need revisions. I think the reality is they are not perfect.
Mm,
So they always, we always have a list of like 10 or 20 things that we want to improve. I think at this point we are partly captive to the fact that they're published by a business. And
yeah.
so, and I think that is just a practicality. For a long time, we literally made these things in my basement. And then, my husband was like, no plastic bags in the bathroom. It was just crazy. And we were getting hate mail from people saying, why can't you get this to us? We're a little bit in that situation now because we tried to come up with a shorter version and we're making kits. But so I went to a company and they make it. But then what happens, in terms of revisions is very dependent on them. So I think the revisions come both from us knowing this didn't work that well,
Mhm.
or but also from changes in the field. For example, we're seeing many more adults who haven't had a diagnosis before who are quite bright. And that is different than what we saw, even 25 years ago, when not, I mean, we definitely saw some autistic kids who were very smart, but we also, it was just a different group. Who is referred in preschool is different than who's referred at school age, and it's different from who's referred at time. So those kinds of things say, wait a minute, we're going to have to figure out better ways of addressing this.
Yeah.
So always, I would say, but then the publisher, like there's going to be a revised ADOS. And we have been bugging the publisher for years to do it. And now they're finally ready. So we are working away at a new version, but it's, we do it and then it takes the publisher another whole year to lay out all the forms and figure out what they're doing. But you should tell people that are listening, we have lists. If people have complaints, let us know. We will file them away. We can't do anything often immediately, but we are listening and trying to figure out how to make the thing better.
Oh yeah, I appreciate that. I read about how much input you take on from like people in the community and people with autism. So with the current condition of the autism assessment, what do you think the the overall assessment needs? What are the biggest gaps?
That's a really good question. I mean, I think how you put information together is we have not specified that. We really have left it up to the clinician. So you may have, these days you may have a parent who gives reports on the ADI, which is this long interview. Then you may see the person and do an ADOS, which is just scored. The ADOS is scored from the time you start it to the time you finish it, like 45 minutes. You don't score anything else. So there's, because that you want it to be reliable, but then also you have information about like what are the other things that are happening in people's lives that, for example, a parent might know, might not know. So how do you put that all together? And I think we don't tell people how to do that. We really leave it up to the clinician. And I think that is both good because you hope the clinicians are good working with whoever the person is who's come for the diagnosis. But it also means people don't know what to do. If you're getting, if you have somebody who really feels like they have autism and you see them on the ADOS and they don't look like they have autism, what do you do?
Mm.
Or you have a parent who is describing all kinds of things and you don't see it, what do you do? And so that's a gap. I think we also, so far, the ADOS at least has worked quite well across different cultures. But it really is, which includes sort of gender. So, but it really is up to the clinician to modify things, to say, wait a minute, I have in front of me, a young woman who is, interested in princesses and not in cars. So I need to pull out this toy or whatever. And that's not as well specified as it should be of how can you be flexible within it. So I think that's another issue. And we are dealing with the practicalities of a medical system, particularly in the United States, that's very focused on procedures. Like, what do you do in the office? That's how billing works. And often you need other information. And so how do you incorporate that information? Both from the person seeking the diagnosis, but also from other people who might know them in other circumstances.
Okay, yeah, yeah, and Something that something that interests me is, especially now more and more, is this idea of early screening,
Hmm.
even if it's by like a PCP.
Hmm.
Um, so I have a couple of questions on that. Is one is, does this screening, is it as standardized as, let's say, an assessment or one of these instruments? Like, how do we know like the PCP is equipped and can handle this screening? And then does the screening help the overall process of the assessment? Now, we know that it would help the treatment plan. The earlier you get the treatment, the better off, the better the outcome. But
Hmm.
does that kind of help the assessment at that younger age as well?
I mean, I think the screenings help get people to think about the possibility of autism. At this point, most of the screening is either questionnaires for parents filling out or very brief things that are people are experimenting with. So in terms of like showing a kid an iPad and seeing if they look at two children playing together or they look at a tree, you know. But there isn't yet, so there's beginning evidence that those might provide you useful information, but it's very, very new. And I think you're right. How people are going to use that information is not clear. I think if people use it like one source of information, it's just like one thing, then that's fine. I mean, it gives them an idea of like, wait a minute, I need to stop and worry about this. So that's good. It gets people thinking about autism. But if people use it in place of like actually spending time with the child and figuring out how does the child go about doing things and what are they interested in and how can you get them to do the things like talking that you want them to do, I think that would be really harmful. So I think the screening, if it's just getting people to think about stuff, it's fine. But if it's treated as an answer, it's not. Like, actually, we just got a referral of a child who has been screened numerous times, never got a diagnosis, has a developmental delay category, and he's in a preschool program. He's been there for a year, and I think he's got autism, and nobody has really looked at this carefully. It's like, what are you thinking? So that I feel like it's not an end, it's a beginning, you know. And I think it's, if you think about like going to a doctor and they do like a blood panel, mostly they don't stop. That's a start. It's not an end, unless they say, aha, you have strep throat, I'm putting you on this. Most of the time it's just a beginning. And that's where it's important.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. Okay. So this idea of, as you described that child in preschool going through those numerous screenings, it's like this idea of spectrum, as we kind of lump everybody with autism into this wide spectrum. I'm kind of concerned that, for a couple of different reasons. Maybe the biggest one is how wide or how much of a variety there is. Let's say from like a level one high functioning to a level three that has completely different looks to it. And my concern is how do people from the outside looking in, how do they know? Like how do we teach society about this broad spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, I agree. I don't know. I think part of the problem, I mean, the reason why we would start with autism and not just say, all right, it's actually three different things or two different things. I think there's two reasons. One is that at early ages, you can't tell. We can tell that a 2-year old or 3-year old has autism. We can't predict, especially at 2, we can't predict, are they going to be, even if are they going to be brilliant with autism and getting a PhD in physics, or are they going to be nonverbal? So we can't tell. And we can begin to tell it's gradual at like 3 and 4 and 5, but we can't tell with the tiny kids. And we want to get them in services. I mean, one of the things our Lancet Commission really tried to say is kids should be able to get services before they even get a full diagnosis. You know, if you're worried about the kid, get them in and then say, all right, sometime this year, we got to do a better assessment so we know him better. So he's not like the little guy I just described, but let's not wait. But we don't know. So that's one reason why we need sort of autism spectrum. The other reason is there's a ton of people in the middle between the physicist and the person who can't talk. And what do we do with them? I mean, we've been working at trying to have a better definition of profound autism, of like people that are really very handicapped. And we can do that. But then what about everybody else? And there's still a spectrum from people that are really totally independent and just have some struggles with some of the social things or some of the sensory things that affect people with autism. And then there's people who are really, very, their lives are very different because of the autism, even though they're bright and they have they have many strengths. So where do we put them? And I don't know. And the trouble is those people are mostly not making podcasts. they're there and we see them in the clinic, but they're not, and for now, actually, many of them are not getting help at all. Mm-hmm. And so what do we do about them? So I don't know, but I don't feel like I have the answer at all, and I get why, a few years ago we thought, oh, it'll be genetics. Everyone will know what their genetic disorder is and they won't need autism. But the reality is the genetics, even when you know what the genetics are, 1/3 of the people might have autism and 1/3 of the people have epilepsy and 1/3 of the people, there is no single genetic cause of autism only, and then most people with autism don't have these. So I don't know. I'm ready to listen to you, Ryan, and what we should do that would be more helpful. And it's so confusing to families, I think, I feel like, and to the public, because the public thinks everybody, people with autism are like the good doctor, which is just not true. But there are people who do really well.
Yeah.
So I don't know. I don't know.
It's easier for society looking in to recognize like the good doctor and then recognize the profound autism. But there's so much in between. And the genetic, not one thing, and not even if you have that genetic dysfunction, I guess, if you will, it doesn't necessarily mean autism.
Yep.
So there's a whole patchwork of things going on way upstream in our biology that is just hard to capture. This idea of the spectrum, though, is like, I get concerned about how people view it and not having distinct edges. I heard Dr. Vinstra Vanderwill, I believe, talk about not having edges so we can, better have more understanding of like this group of people with autism and this group of people with autism. But there's just so much.
Yep. Yep.
I'm hoping that since you mentioned and we touched on profound autism and the Lancet Commission, I'm hoping that you can give an update. That was released in 2022, I believe, and just seeing how that goes or how that's going.
Yeah, I don't know. I think, I mean, one of the things I want to say about the Lancet Commission is profound autism was just a tiny part of it, but it's gotten more attention than anything else. And the major thing that the Lancet Commission was trying to say is we need more research on what actually makes a difference in people's lives. And that we do need to work with the autistic community, both people with autism and also parents, to figure out what makes a difference, because we know so much more about biology, which is very interesting, but is on the whole has not helped. And so it will help, I think, someday, but it's very long term. And we need to know more, just like how many hours of something does a kid need, and how do you decide, and does telehealth CBT work, for whom and why not, or why, and those kind of things. So that was the main point. And then also across cultures, because most of the research has really come from Europe or the US, or to some extent some of the wealthier Asian countries. But there's a lot of autistic people out there who don't get anything. So that I'll just put in my push for Lancet, because profound autism just hit the news more. I think that there's now there's now the Profound Autism Alliance, and there's I think both the major research organizations are recognizing profound autism. There was a lot of conflict over what would go into, they're trying to pass a new bill for autism cares in Congress. And there were really very different groups who were saying, if you mention profound autism, we won't sign it. And then other people saying, you have to mention it or we won't sign it. I think they've agreed on words, and but I'm not sure even what those words are. But I think the idea of like high support needs. So I think that's a big step, and at least recognizing, it's just ironic because most of the biological research on autism, that at least the genetics, has been on kids who are very handicapped. And then all the other research is mostly on people who are not. And so there's just, again, this middle that doesn't get addressed. And then there's also we need behavioral research on people that have more severe issues. And we need, I don't know how much we need the genetics of brighter people. I'm more skeptical I'm skeptical that's going to help a whole lot. But anyway, it's just, I think people are getting more used to profound autism and the idea. But there's various groups, there are groups that want us to declare who has profound autism when they're 3 years old, which I think is really wrong, because you don't know. On the other hand, I think accepting the fact that there is this broad spectrum, and sometimes people who can't speak for themselves are left out, and that we do need families, and we need to recognize that someone needs to advocate for these people, because they're not able to talk to write books or speak, or they can speak, but they can't really stick up for themselves and what they need.
Yeah, I just read a paper, and I think it just came out about this university or research center claimed that they could predict profound autism versus non-profound autism based off of the size of a brain, or something in the cell biology, if I'm not mistaken. So I thought that was kind of interesting.
I don't know. I mean, they might. I mean, I do think there's certain genetic disorders that are very much tied to intellectual disability and often seizures. And so the chances, if you have those, if you have autism, which not everybody does, of also having an intellectual disability are high. But I would hate for people to be limiting kids when they're very little, saying they're never going to be able to do this or that.
Hmm.
I think, what we're interested in, just because we've been doing research so long, is the trajectory. Like, how are you changing? And if you can use that plus who is helping and who's not, then I think that's much more useful. It's just that from a medical point of view, it's more time consuming if you have to have 2 or 3 points instead of just one.
Yeah, I want to highlight a couple of things after that. One, I don't remember if it was in Nature Reviews Disease Primers or that Lancet Commission. I believe it was the Lancet Commission that it's mentioned that it's easier to get approval for like medical specialists than it is these lower level like treatment
Yep.
plan options, which
Yep.
is a concern.
Yep.
That's
I remember having a meeting at one of the finance companies in New York. I forget which one, but like Chase or JP Morgan and the physician in charge said, "Yeah, we'll pay, any kind of medical specialist, you know, but we won't pay like a education person,
mhm.
to work with a child." And they're like, "Cuz we think we have the cream of the crop, reimbursement." But it's like at some point somebody needs to sit down with the kid and work with them. you know so you could have 20 medical specialists, but nobody's going to help toilet train that child,
Yeah,
or help him learn to say, cup.
yeah.
So I think that's part of our crazy system in terms of medicine. And it's just, they've worked it out. Like, just as a person getting older, I've had many more medical procedures in the last few years than ever before. And you realize that there are technicians. If you go to have some kind of cardiology exam, somebody prepares you, there's a nurse, there's all these different levels before you actually see the physician. But they're preparing you for whatever the physician is going to do. Whereas I think in autism, we just need people who are going to work, work with people. And that it doesn't require a PhD or a PsyD or an MD, but it does require thought and kindness and planning and experience. So I don't know.
That idea of those people on the front lines, if you will, those so-called lower level
Mhm.
people, they're the ones that's going to have the most impact, I think, and the
Yep.
best for
Yep.
the best outcome.
Yep.
And that's, I guess, one of my concerns is with that diverse knowledge and information or whatever about this idea of this wide spectrum, does that interfere with some of the research and financial backing and people that make decisions? Does that interfere with their recognition? So, I don't know.
Yeah, I don't either. I do think that even like the levels, the levels in DSM-5 are there because we were told as a committee we have to have levels. And the whole committee was worried about them. So they're really written almost circularly because we were really worried that there would be people that wouldn't get services because they were the wrong level, or that insurance companies wouldn't continue to do services if people weren't moving up levels. And so they don't make any sense.
Yeah,
And we knew that. But it's how do you need to have ways of measuring if somebody's making progress starting where they are. But that is more work than it doesn't fit with our medical system on the whole, you know. And the idea that you go in and have blood tests and somebody says, aha, you have that viral infection, or, which is just not autism. It's not a viral infection. Oh.
and I'm reminded a little bit about those barriers in the medical medicine and then also in education
Mhm.
that the knowledge and information about how someone with autism learns and the current classroom situation has, to my understanding, that I've figured is like four strikes against autism: the
Mhm,
social communication dynamic, the sensory processing dynamic, um, the speech and language dynamic,
mhm,
and then this task switching or this subject switching, which is very much against B3.
mhm.
You know, you 40 to 50 minutes on the subject, then you
Yep,
change subjects. 40
yep,
to 50 minutes. And if you have B3, you hate that. That is very challenging.
yep. You're
So,
I mean, I think there's another, you know, hard choice because on the one hand, I think having, very segregated classes that never interact with anybody except the most autistic kids is not great. But I also think, I mean, school can be torture. I mean, I still some. I mean, I don't have autism, but I just think, how did I spend 8 hours a day sitting with 34 other people all day long doing what someone else told me to do?
yeah,
And I don't have the sensory issues or the social. I mean, I'm not that social, but I think it's it how and what do you come up with as an alternative? And I think it's relevant also not just to autism, but even with kids with ADHD, for example, different issues. But, so being in a big class without a lot of flexibility and then changing classes, as you said. I mean, I recently was on a IEP meeting for a school for a kid I've known forever, and he is going into high school. And I was so impressed because he is autistic, very smart, but autistic. And the they were going to put him in a class that was taught by two teachers, and different class every single class was taught by two different teachers. So he was going to have seven classes, each with two teachers. And the um I think it was like the school psychologist, and we were just like, oh, this is going to be awful. And the school psychologist just said, you know what, why don't we not do this? Like, it would be better for him just to have somebody who's responsible for getting him, I mean, he really does not need an aide following him around all the time, but somebody who's responsible for him all the time, and then let him do what the other kids are doing. And then we're going to have him have fewer classes, not because he's not smart enough, because it's just too many changes.
yeah,
And trying to help his family and him realize maybe it's going to take you, if you want, an honors high school diploma, it might take you an extra year, but you do not have to have seven classes. That is not set in stone for the rest of your life. Let's just get you through this. And maybe he can have two art classes because he's a
mhm,
wonderful artist. Um, and it's not that we're giving up on everything else, it's just let's pace it. But it's very hard, the idea of two teachers and seven classes, 14 teachers, you're right. And I mean, we've been having him like leave class early so he's not in the hallway noisy, go to class. I mean, it's just, anyway.
it's a concern for me, and from my experience as well, is if you have autism and you're navigating society over years
Yeah,
of doing this, all of that expectation and that just plasticity of how you're shaped and developed is very opposing. It's
yeah,
it's many challenges.
yeah. It is. It absolutely is. And it it shouldn't have to be, but it is.
Yeah, and for education, it's hard to change because they have to teach the general population first,
Right.
and
That's right.
then these so-called outliers.
Yeah.
Or yeah, it's tough. I'm anxious to see how that evolves. Which brings me to another question. What does autism look like in 10 years, in your opinion?
Oh, good question. Good question. Um, Actually, I don't know. I mean, I hope that there's less conflict between, the autistic advocacy community and other people. So I feel like the autism's advocates have really important things to say, but sometimes it gets overwhelmingly negative, at least for me as a practitioner. And I hope that gets resolved. I hope we can work out ways of communicating that aren't offensive to people and move toward strategies that people aren't so negative about. um, so I hope that improves, because I think that's a hard thing right now, um, for many practitioners. And you have people who just jump into it full force, but it's just, as someone who often sees smaller kids, and I do think things like behaving yourself reasonably are really important to allow them access to things they want to do.
Mhm.
And somebody has to help the kids figure that out. So that's something I hope gets better. I think that we need to know more for research. I feel like genetics is going to continue on with a ton of money, but I think the reality is that the miracles that are going to come for genetics are not going to affect your average autistic person. They're going to affect someone with some very rare disorder that someone happens to figure out. You can give them a shot when they're born or whatever, and that's not going to affect probably anybody that I see or you see. That would be great if it's true. So I think we need to understand more the relationship between how does the brain actually work, not just in autistic people, but anybody, and then what does that mean for what we do? Because we're human beings. We're like not little brains walking around. We're whole people. So I hope that people move in that direction. And then I hope that I think early intervention is really important, but I think that we need to recognize that early intervention isn't an answer in itself. You want to get kids started and you want to move forward, and particularly in language, we need to see changes early on or they're going to be very slow. But I think we want to also recognize what happens for school age kids and what can we do better, and what happens in teenage years and adults. And I hope that there will be better services and more knowledge about what we could do to make life easier or better for people, and better services for adults.
Yeah, well said. That concern is like the trend of, I guess it's now 1 in 36 children. It's like,
Yeah,
when does that balance, or when does that stop trending that way?
yeah,
It's
I don't
very
know.
concerning. It's very concerning. Okay, so last question, and I'll let you go, Dr. Lord. Um, if you had a magic wand, what would you like to know about autism? If you could have one question answered.
Oh goodness. um I don't know. I don't think there's one. I
One, yeah.
think it's probably different for different people. You know, um, I guess I would like to know better, how do we find the strengths in an individual child or adult that will most help that person have a happy life, and how do we do that? And I don't think there's going to be one answer, but I feel like we're grappling with that all the time. But I don't know. We just look at what we can do and make guesses.
Those strengths are in there too
They
somewhere.
are. They
Yeah, yeah.
absolutely are. They are. Yeah.
And I'm satisfied and pleased that you said that gives them a happy life, leads them to a happy life.
Yeah, I mean, I mean, I guess it's true for anybody, can be happy and people can be not happy,
Yeah.
but how do you do that? How do
Yeah.
you support that? And I think we'll get better at it, but I don't know the answer. If you figure it out, Ryan, let me know.
I would love to. I would love to let you know. That would be my pleasure. Well, Dr. Lord, I can't thank you enough for your time. I know you're very busy impacting the world and the field of autism, and I very much appreciate that. I've I followed your work, and I just love reading your material. Um, so thank you, and just thank you so much.
Well, my pleasure. It's very nice to meet you, Ryan, and I wish you luck with the podcast and your own studies.
Oh,
So,
thank you. Yeah.
okay. All right. Bye.
Bye. Thank you for listening to the conversation with Dr. Catherine Lord. If you are listening to the episode or listening to the podcast, please feel free to leave a review or rating. In podcasting, reviews, ratings, and downloads are huge, and I very much appreciate your feedback. You can contact me at info.fromthespectrum@gmail.com. And thank you for listening to From the Spectrum podcast.